Hello, AP World students. Welcome. This is the lesson here where we're going to be taking a look at Africa and Latin America in the period following World War II. And so we're going to be putting a whole bunch of pieces together. This is a lesson where maybe one or two new elements will be introduced, but by and large, it's about taking some other pieces that we already have and putting them together and seeing how that looks in this novel context. So when we're thinking about, these puzzle pieces, or when we're contextualizing this learning, I'll say that some of the bigger pieces we're going to be putting together are looking at processes of decolonization, like we looked at in South Asia or India. We'll be talking about the Cold War that will play a part in this story today. We're going to be going back to what we've already learned about Africa. Let's think back to new imperialism, the scramble for Africa, the Berlin Conference. And let's also go back to Latin America and consider how things politically and economically shook out following all those various wars for independence, the Latin American revolutions, right? So those are the puzzle pieces that we're going to sort of set on the table and we're going to use to situate our learning today. And if you've got that queued up, then I think you're ready to dive in with me and explore what's going on in these two enormous parts of the world, in Latin America and Africa, in the period following World War II. So let's jump in. We learned way back when that the process of imperialization or colonization in Africa happened swiftly, right? I mean, it happened in about 30 years. Suddenly, it's sort of the blink of an eye, historically speaking, when it went from like minimal European involvement to maximal European involvement in Africa. And I'll say the process of decolonization happened even faster. In many ways, and we've learned this already, in many ways, following the magnitude of the disaster or the magnitude of the costs of World War II, the Western European, imperial nations were eager to divest or let go of their colonial holdings, recognizing, in particular in places like Britain, recognizing we just can't hold these anymore. We are in no position to be able to do this any longer. And so, for the most part, all these places in Africa, all these nations today became independent in the period of 5 or 6 years. If you look at all these sort of dates of independence, it's all ranging, for the most part, again, many of them from the late 1950s through the early 1960s. There are exceptions, of course. There's always exceptions. I mean, some of the exceptions are, places like Egypt or Ethiopia had become independent much earlier, or a country like Algeria is going to have to fight its war for independence. Algeria had been a French colony, and the French had been eager to maintain control of that, given its proximity to France just across the Mediterranean, and there was this whole Algerian war for independence, and soon enough, the French let go of that. The French were doing the same thing, like, maybe we should hold on to our colony in Vietnam. You know what, never mind. This is too much of a pain in the rear end. So the French were having their own journey, let's say. But these places are becoming independent. Now, I'm sorry to report that for most of these places, the look of the new government is not excellent. All right, they were somewhat unstable governments, and they were inclined to authoritarianism. And if you're asking why, I'd say, well, their new governments, I don't know, kind of looked in a way like what the old colonial government looked like, And also, we've learned that some of these nations themselves were misbegotten or poorly conceived in the first place back in the days of the Berlin Conference. And so civil war would become, heartbreakingly frequent in Africa in the decades following decolonization. And there's some famous ones. The one that is most infamous would be in the nation of Rwanda. But just again, this example of different ethnic groups that are sort of pieced together or placed together hodgepodge, or in ways that didn't make much sense on the ground. Like those new nations there was just some instability there, and in certain cases, they broke apart, or in certain cases, things destabilized in discouraging ways. We should speak about South Africa for in a few respects. First off, South Africa South Africa has all sorts of natural advantages. The climate is, well, it's lovely. It's a Mediterranean style climate. So think Southern California or Italy, Southern France. Apartheid is pardon me, not apartheid. The climate in South Africa is lovely. Apartheid is not. Let's talk about what apartheid is. Apartheid is the system of racial segregation that was in place following World War II. So you probably know something. You certainly do know something about the segregation system that was set in place in many parts of the United States, particularly the South after the Civil War, and that's some wickedness that was going on here, right? This is some screwed up stuff, and we get to study it in American history, and as we ought to. And I'd say that the apartheid system in South Africa sort of, it's like perversely they looked at the American segregation system and said, yeah, that's a good start, but what if we took it even further, right? So here's our situation, what's called the National Party government of South Africa. South Africa is a former British colony. It had been independent since around the time of World War I. So this is an independent nation. It is governed by a white government led by this, what's called the National Party. And in the wake of the Depression and World War II, these sort of, these stressors, let's say, political and economic stressors, the solution to them, or for their own safety or security, the safety and security of the white population in Africa, they cook up this scheme by which, called apartheid, which just means sort of apartness or separateness, this profound degree of racial segregation that is just an expression of profound injustice. So you have the black population in South Africa is 3/4 of the population. They are moved onto what's euphemistically called homelands, right? So these homelands make up, what does it say, 13% of the land. These homelands are guarded with fences. There are guards posted. There are guard dogs. To get to leave a homeland, you need to have a pass, right? So if you're a black South African, you have to have a pass to leave your homeland. What's the excuse that would give you a pass? Well, you're going to go work, right? You're going to go work for, a white farmer or a white, diamond mine owner. So you have a pass or permission to leave this land, this homeland, only to go to work. And then there's curfews, and it's really something wicked, guys. I don't know, we could sort of keep getting into it, but it's something that's just so profoundly ridiculous, right? Where it's the black people are sort of corralled into these camps and they're let out to work, and the government and the country otherwise is sort of by, of, and for the whites, and the blacks are sort of kept contained in these pens and let out when they can do labor for us. So it's a fouled up system, right? And for a long time, they were able to say, hey, it's like the United States does it, right? It's like that's it. And after the United States stopped doing it in 1964, 64, 65, then then South Africa's in this weird spot of being kind of like the last one doing this, doing this particular type of white-black segregation thing. And there's a lot of pressure that comes from the international community outside South Africa, but there's a ton of pressure within South Africa, right? The African National Congress is sort of a pan-African organization. It's not only in South Africa, but there is a presence there in South Africa, and black South Africans begin to sort of rise up and speak out. The most famous leader of this is a man named Nelson Mandela. And so Mandela is sort of black South Africa's version of Gandhi. I think there's less of a religious component to Mandela's teachings, but there is sort of a deeply moral component to Mandela's teaching. And so Mandela is jailed for, more or less kind of agitating the peace and disturbing against the existing government. He's thrown in jail from 1963 and sits in jail until 1990. This is a long time for kind of a trumped up charge. And this has the rest of the world's attention. eventually there's enough kind of economic sanctions that are placed on South Africa by the outside world. By the 1980s, this is really ramping up. By the 1980s, and as the Cold War is starting to wind down, for a long time, South Africa was an ally to the United States in the Cold War. And one of the rules in the Cold War is if you're on our side in the Cold War, then we'll kind of turn a blind eye to some of the nasty stuff that maybe is going on in your backyard. Well, by the time the Cold War is winding down, the United States is also saying, hey, figure this out, right? This is a screwed up deal. And so in 1989, which is like when the Berlin Wall comes down and a lot of the old Soviet states are voting for their independence shortly after that, another kind of profound thing is happening in South Africa, and that is the white government led by this fellow named F.W. de Klerk releases Mandela from jail. That government begins to undo a lot of the laws that made up the apartheid system. And the key part, just like it was in the United States, is like allowing black people to vote, right? Allowing their voice to be heard, allowing them to be equal participants in the political system. And when that happens, South Africans elected Nelson Mandela president, and there was a sort of transition out of whites only rule and into just a rule of the people who lived there, whites and blacks. And Mandela is, he was a profoundly good leader, actually. And again, one of the reasons I say that is because it wasn't a spirit of retribution following this. Because lots of times there's sort of like, following something like this, there would be a lot of maybe people who'd be lined up against a brick wall and shot or something like that. And that's not really how that shook out in South Africa. And that is largely to Mandela's credit. I'd love to tell you that the history of South Africa ever since then has been smooth sailing. It is not. There have been any number of issues, but HIV/AIDS has been a huge one. We're going to get back to that in a second. I mentioned the Cold War. The Cold War plays a funny part in Africa's, post-colonization story, and so because there's this polarity, there's this United States saying join us on our side, and the Soviet Union saying join us on our side, and all these brand new independent nations are being pressured to kind of line up behind one side or the other. And you can see here in these propaganda images that like the Soviets made a clear appeal to to Africans. And what they were saying is, in a sense, we never colonized you, right? It was the West. It was Western Europe that colonized you. We weren't doing that. And the whole Soviet or the whole communist appeal, again, is sort of like, it's economic classes are everything. Racial distinctions are nothing. So it's sort of like pan-racial appeals or unity that sort of fits in the Soviet vocabulary very cleanly because they say everything is economic exploitation and economic oppression. And so lots of Soviet propaganda would have sort of like, white and black people together sort of opposing the outside oppressor. And American attempts to sort of solicit African support tended to sort of focus on issues of prosperity or issues of liberty, freedom, political freedoms. We're just kind of speaking different vocabularies. And so different African nations are sort of drifting behind either side. But the fact of the matter is the Cold War wasn't really very good for Africa. The Cold War was sort of the United States and the Soviet Union's thing, and the rest of the world's getting pulled into it. And Africans themselves weren't really benefiting from it. In fact, in the long run, many African nations that sort of lined up behind the Soviet Union and took their economy in a socialist direction really hurt themselves economically in the long term. Like this just isn't a huge benefit for them. I will also say the Soviets were quick to point out, that, hey, Africans, do you like the apartheid system? We bet you don't. Do you know that the United States kind of tacitly or on some level supports the apartheid system by partnering with South Africa's government? You don't want to be friends with those guys. You don't want to partner with those guys. You want to come over here with us. And so there's all kinds of like weird dysfunctional stuff happening in Africa, and Africa's kind of caught having to choose, and it's something that's not really Africa's fight. Again, also not to speak of Africa as one thing, because Africa is enormous and it's many different countries, but this is the dynamic. And when we sort of talk about contemporary issues, you'd say, well, the extraordinary diversity in Africa is beautiful in a sense. It's like there's a kingdom aspect to that we can appreciate as Christians, but it's also, it's culturally tricky. It's politically difficult sometimes. And certainly you'd say those old arbitrary borders don't help that along. So that's like something that sometimes contributes to instability in African states. There's a legacy of colonial rule, the rule of, we learned about like the Belgian Congo, for example. This is not, it's like, you don't say to Africans, like, why don't you be more like your European, colonizers and have more government like that? It's like, well, that was fundamentally, totally screwed up. So, corrupted or oppressive rule has been the norm, right? And so when the baton got handed off to Africans, in many cases, some of that stayed as a continuity instead of changing, or the changes occurred slowly. In many ways, when Africans sort of said, well, we don't want to be, we reject our colonial past or our colonial history, along with that, sometimes it was a throwing the baby out with the bathwater thing of like rejecting economic freedoms, right? Or rejecting, market economies in favor of command economies or socialist economies that sort of led to unproductive economic life. And let's also point to modern health crises, in particular since the 1990s. HIV/AIDS. I mean, things have gotten somewhat better, but boy, oh boy, HIV/AIDS was bad in the rest of the world. It has been a disaster in Africa. I mean, if we just look like this chart here says the estimated percentage of adults who were HIV positive in 2003 in some parts of Africa, that was more than a third of the population was HIV positive. And this has to do with all sorts of social stigmas related to STDs, and a whole bunch of crazy nutso misinformation that was there in this part of the world regarding AIDS, and it's a kind of a dark and screwed up story there. But suffice to say, getting these ARV drugs, these antiretroviral drugs that are used to treat HIV and prevent it from sort of blooming into AIDS, and they've been available for 20 some years. Like getting access to those in Africa took some time, and like the improvement there has been good. But HIV/AIDS was a huge public health crisis, and malaria. Malaria again is perpetual. It's always existed in the tropics. The key is modern Africa, since the colonization period and since the advent of these big cities, there's like large, densely packed cities, which are just like a haven for malaria. And so malaria outbreaks are problematic, and malaria keeps evolving and shifting, so it's a difficult disease to combat. So this is some of the pictures, some of the challenges in contemporary Africa. Let's do a question to check in here. Kwame Nkrumah, president of Ghana in 1963, said, "Under a major political union of Africa, there could emerge a united Africa, great and powerful, in which the territorial boundaries, which are the relics of colonialism, will become obsolete and superfluous, working for the complete and total mobilization of economic planning organization under a unified political direction. The forces that unite us are far greater than the difficulties that divide us at present, and our goal must be the establishment of Africa's dignity, progress, and prosperity." Big words, big vision. Can you pierce through some of the language, and what is he saying? Which accurately describes the historical context in which Nkrumah wrote? A, the rapid industrialization of several African nations. Is that the context in which he's writing? B, the creation of a single unified Pan-African state. Is that the context in which he's writing? C, the continuity of Europe's direct rule of African colonies. Or D, the independence of former European colonies in Africa. Correct answer, the context that he's writing on, is the independence of former European colonies. And he's talking about, what if we created a united Africa, the way that we have a United States of America, or the way that Simon Bolivar hoped for a United States of South America. Next question. Which best exemplifies the difficulties that divide the people within and among African nations mentioned in the passage? A, huge debts owed to larger African nations by smaller African nations. B, pandemic health concerns such as HIV/AIDS, cholera, and Ebola. C, tensions within various ethnic groups within several African nations. Or D, significant environmental damage as a result of mining in Africa. best answer here is C. All right. Now, I'll note B and D are real factors. For B, we have the wrong time period here in 1963. D is also a factor, but that's not the particular difficulties that divide Africans that he's referring to there. Okay, let's try to quickly pivot over to Latin America. In Latin America, the key dynamic to get at and to understand is the troublesome relationship between African American nations and the United States of America. Because again, this is all in the broader context of the Cold War, right? And when the United States is one of the two big polar nations in the Cold War, the United States has some interest in saying, are you lined up with us or are you lined up with the Soviets? And nations near to the United States, like in our proximity, there is a great deal of interest, American interest, in making sure that the Soviets don't have access or don't have, a foothold right in our own backyard. Now, that backyard language is sort of precisely what tends to agitate Latin American nations and Latin American peoples. There's this like Jekyll and Hyde love-hate relationship in many ways between Latin American nations and the United States. On one hand, the United States is, like I write, this beacon of liberty, this beacon of opportunity. It was the first nation into the breach with all these Atlantic revolutions, the first sort of, representative democracy in the Western Hemisphere, all these things in which the U.S. has has some positive significance or influence or some role modeling in some certain, I don't mean that paternalistically, but in some sense, maybe that's the case. On the other hand, the United States earns a reputation of being overbearing meddlers, of being the older brother who keeps saying, hey, let me do this for you, and don't do it that way, do it this way instead, and kind of elbowing Latin America out of the way, or speaking to the rest of the world and saying, hey, the Western Hemisphere is kind of our backyard, or we'll call the shots on what's going on there. And Latin American nations are like, who elected you that role? Like, why do you get to do that for us, right? And this goes all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine in the United States in the 1820s, and Theodore Roosevelt declaring that the United States has police power in Latin America and the Caribbean. Like there's all kinds of ways in which the U.S. gains a reputation as being meddlers, and that results in no small amount of resentment among Latin Americans and Latin American countries with the United States. Okay. Also, complicating this is that governments in Latin America, frequently following their own independence, like we learned, were these caudillo-style governments, right? In which, like we've talked about, where there's like strongman rule, where, figuratively speaking, one guy, there's all this democratic squabbling and arguing and bickering and corruption, and finally one guy shoots a gun in the air and says, everyone sit down and be quiet, I'm in charge here, and we're going to do it this way. And it's not ideal, let's put it that way. And certainly Americans, people in the United States of America, would never, ever, ever subject ourselves to that. At least we like to think so. In the 1950s, early Cold War period, there's all this CIA analysis where it basically says, in this troublesome language, like, Latin American nations and peoples are hot-blooded and incapable of kind of the sort of like being governed by constitutional systems. And so the basic upshot is these caudillos or these sort of dictators are basically as good as you're going to get, right? So better to sort of prop them up and partner with them, because your thing of hoping for something in Argentina to emerge that looks like American-style representative democracy, it's just a pipe dream. It's just not going to happen. And so you have these repressive rulers who are being kind of propped up by the American government, and the American government is doing that in part because they say, hey, this repressive ruler is on our side in the Cold War. So you're on our side in the Cold War, so we'll help prop you up. For all sorts of folks in those countries, they would look at this and say, this ruler is corrupt, this ruler is a dictator. Behind him, I see evidence that the United States is backing up and supporting him. So I don't like the ruler, I don't like the United States. What other options do we have here? Enter socialist agitators, right? Enter Che Guevara or Fidel Castro in Cuba, these people who say, can't you see it's all corrupt? Can't you see it's all sort of a capitalist game? Like, can't you see, like, we, the people, need to rise up and take power back from the system? And so there's like this dysfunctional dichotomy between sort of like two extremes, and the U.S. says there's no good options here, so we'll support that bad option, but that sort of also tends to result in giving oxygen to socialist revolutionaries and socialist agitators, and then the United States would often help, like, those repressive caudillo rulers or dictators to go after socialist agitators like Fidel Castro or Che Guevara, and sometimes it blows up in our face. Cuba famously becomes a socialist or communist country under Fidel Castro, and that was terrifying for the United States. Much later, when we get access to the Soviet books, we sort of recognize that from a Soviet perspective, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara were really more of a headache for them. But at any rate, that's, we took it very seriously. In a weird way, maybe our propping up of those dictators and helping them go after those socialist revolutionaries might have created more extremism, right? I think that's fair to say. In recent decades, the tension really hasn't been as much about communism versus capitalism as much as it's been about drug trades, drug cartels, difficulties there, like an enormous drug demand for drugs in the United States, and suppliers for drugs from South and Central America moving through Mexico and other places to bring those drugs into the United States. It's a challenge. I'm not here to tell you the answer on that. I don't know. It's just a challenge. There's a video that you're going to get a chance to watch, but that's it. You now move on to your LEQ. Thank you guys so much for your good work on this, and we will talk more next time. Take care, gang.